Starting times and respect everyone's chaotic schedules. For all of you, as you know, it's an unusual time here. So shall we get going? The subcommittee will come to order. As we get going, this is our first one, and I'd like to actually say I'm elated to have Ms. Sewell sitting next to me, one of the people I genuinely like, and my little boy is fascinated with your jacket. If you hear sudden noise, I have a 2-year-old in the little room right behind us. So shall we actually get going? I was going to let you introduce your, do you have a witness?
I do.
I'm going to let you, when we get done with, so let's do opening statements and then let's get this going. First, good morning. Welcome to the 119th Congress and our first Ways and Means Oversight hearing. I have a script here, but I'm going to go off of it because I already shared with you. For many of us, we've had a couple years here, the fussing back and forth between what was put, the cash that was put in the Inflation Reduction Act, hiring lots of people. The fact of the matter is we now have data that how hard it has been, almost impossible, to hire those very staffers. We actually have data in here that we'd like to present and walk through on the actual spend versus the actual projected collections, now that we're, 30 plus months in, and how far off target we are. We have data in here talking from the IRS's own information when 31% of the phone calls during tax season are actually being answered. Is the solution an army of more bodies in the same environment where when they had even the resources they were not able to hire? Or is it ultimately a technology solution, just as so much of the rest of the world has actually stepped into? My personal fixation is how do you modernize the IRS so it can meet its mission and actually reduce the friction with the population, taxpayers, those who are just trying to survive and trying to understand. Our history here, particularly when you get near the IRS, it becomes a partisan whipping boy. But the fact of the matter is you have a country that's borrowing about $70,000, $80,000 every second. And by the end of this decade, those numbers go up dramatically. Maybe actually understanding what we're doing, how we're doing it. Could we do it better? Could we do it fairer? Could we do it with more public understanding? And maybe less sense of hostility between the agency, Congress, and the very public we represent. And with that, let me hand it over to the ranking member, who I'm elated to be sitting next to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the new ranking member of the Oversight Committee, I'd like to first thank you for your warm words of introduction, as well as for the opportunity to work with you on behalf of the American people. I also want to welcome my Democratic colleagues to our first subcommittee hearing. I look forward to working with everyone on this subcommittee on important oversight issues before Congress. Today, I am pleased to have the opportunity to talk about the Internal Revenue Service and the historic Inflation Reduction Act. The IRA made a once-in-a-generation investment in modernizing the IRS. The results have been record-breaking. The IRS announced that it collected $1 billion from high-wealth taxpayers due to the IRA funding. It dramatically improved taxpayer service, including answering more calls, providing extended in-person outreach to rural and underserved taxpayers, and simplifying notices and letters. I can tell you that in my district, in the Black Belt of Alabama, we have some of the highest audit communities for the EIT recipients. EITC, as we know, the Earned Income Tax Credit, is for moderate to low income folks being able to reduce their tax liability if they so qualify. These are hardworking Americans who make less than the minimum wage with a median income close to $30,000 in my district. The IRS attempts to even the playing field, giving resources that ensure the Inflation Reduction Act, with those monies, we attempt to even the playing field by giving resources that ensure wealthy individuals who have evaded taxes are audited proportionally. And we still have a lot of ways to go. Yet my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to hamstring the IRS at a very important point where the IRA funding is actually making a difference. This is abundantly clear by the fact that they have rescinded over $20 billion in enforcement funds, and they have frozen another $20 billion in the previous continuing resolution. We need to fix this issue, and slashing funds is not the solution. The IRA funding is not an endless piggy bank for the majority. Mr. Chairman, I would be remiss if I did not mention the elephant in the room, which is, of course, this faux Department of Efficiency, Government Efficiency, or DOGE, and its unlawful access of the taxpayer-sensitive payment systems and confidential taxpayer information. DOGE's takeover of the federal payment system is an egregious invasion of the privacy of every American, especially every American taxpayer. Federal tax law specifically ensures that Americans' tax return information is confidential. As you know, unauthorized disclosure of this information is a felony. Elon Musk and DOGE should not be rummaging around in the confidential information of private taxpayers and private citizens. No one knows what information DOGE has accessed or how it will use such information. And Mr. Chairman, we should all be concerned that our private, confidential taxpayer information has been exposed. Today, I want to welcome all of our witnesses. I really look forward to the opportunity to hear from you and for us to have a substantive conversation about the IRA funding for the IRS. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Sewell. All right, now let's do some quick introductions, and I'm going to let you introduce Ms. Olson. Is it Hayden DuBois?
DuBois.
DuBois? I was never going to get that right, but you had that. Is a data analytics director at the Foundation for Government Accountability. Pete Stepp is president of the National Taxpayers Union. Mish Ladwin?
Chairman, it's Minesh Ladwa.
Lad-
Minesh Ladwa.
Manish, all right, is Global Solution Managers for Tax and Revenue Management at SAP. And Kristen
Koselek.
that one I might have gotten, is Managing Director for Financial Management and Assurance Team at the Government Accountability Office.
And I'd like to introduce probably the easiest pronounced name on the on this witness list, Miss Nina Olson. Ms. Olson is a former national taxpayer advocate. She is now the executive director of the Center for Taxpayer Rights. Welcome, Ms. Olson, to this subcommittee hearing, and we look forward to your testimony.
Each of you will have 5 minutes, and at that point, we will begin statements and questions. Hayden.
Well, Chairman Schweikert, Ranking Member Sewell, and members of the committee, thank you for having me here today and for hosting this very important hearing. My testimony is going to differ just slightly from some of my counterparts and focus on a related issue of the capacity of the Congressional Budget Office to accurately estimate the fiscal effects of legislation, including the Inflation Reduction Act. Unfortunately, CBO tends to underestimate the costs associated with measures that would increase the size of government and overestimate the cost of tax relief for Americans. And one of the most prominent examples of that, of course, pertains to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is obviously relevant to today's hearing. Following the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act, CBO predicted the legislation would decrease the federal budget deficit by $58.1 billion over the following decade. But a 2024 update by CBO suggested the law would actually increase the deficit by roughly $300 billion. It turns out the CBO's revision reflected a $224 billion upward adjustment in green energy expenses. And additionally, CBO projected that the nearly $80 billion dedicated to IRS enhanced enforcement measures would actually reduce the deficit by $180 billion, but by the end of fiscal year 2024, the IRS announced just $1.3 billion had been collected through those increased enforcement measures, compared to the $7.2 billion CBO projected it would have collected in that first year. In fact, more money had been spent to hire these new IRS agents than they had collected in revenue. For every $1 in new revenue gained, these enforcement efforts had cost $1.04. According to the Economic Policy Innovation Center, the CBO's faulty estimates are a result of the projected far higher rate of return on IRS enforcement efforts than what actually occurred. As a result, CBO's estimated return on investment was off by more than sixfold. And this is not the first time that CBO has made these mistakes. In 2010, the CBO predicted that approximately 13 million Americans would enroll through Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act in all 50 states. By 2019, actual enrollment had reached 19.5 million in just 34 states. In the food stamp program, CBO estimated that food stamp changes contained in the 2009 stimulus bill would have cost approximately $20 billion. A decade later, CBO revised its estimate and said food stamp-driven spending from the stimulus bill had reached $43 billion, more than twice as much as their initial estimates. Likewise, another provision of the 2009 stimulus was the enhanced unemployment benefits, which CBO predicted would cost $39.2 billion. 6 years later, CBO revised their score to $64 billion. And on the revenue side, as Ways and Means Committee Chairman Smith has correctly noticed, actual 2024 corporate receipt collections reached $529 billion, well ahead of the $421 billion predicted by CBO following the passage of the historic Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. In fact, cumulative revenues are $500 billion above where CBO estimated they would be following the passage of TCJA. Now, there are a variety of reasons why CBO has made these inaccurate estimates. For the Inflation Reduction Act, they failed to account for developments in green energy markets and substantially overestimated the IRS's return on investment. For Medicaid, they dramatically understated enrollment. For the 2009 stimulus package, they were wrong about their assumptions regarding the record-slow Obama economic recovery. And for TCJA, they failed to predict the tremendous impact that lower taxes would have on the middle class. Unfortunately, the cumulative effect of these errors demonstrates CBO's implicit bias for more government spending through provisions like the IRA and higher taxes. Now, CBO will undoubtedly have a role to play in scoring key pieces of legislation, especially as it relates to the ongoing reconciliation conversation. But already the baseline CBO uses misleads Congress because CBO assumes, one, certain discretionary appropriations will continue without statutory budget authority. 2, all discretionary appropriations will continue to grow with inflation. 3, certain mandatory spending programs will continue beyond their expiration. And 4, Social Security and Medicare payments will continue at their current levels even after the trust funds are depleted. Finally, by using a current law baseline rather than a current policy baseline, the likely effect of various programs on outlays is distorted. Congress should not only evaluate CBO's fiscal scores with scrutiny, but also consider amending law to have the baseline more accurately resemble reality. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stepp.
Chairman Schweikert, Ranking Member Sewell, members of the committee, you honor NTU and taxpayers everywhere by holding this hearing. As you know, NTU has had a long history of involvement in the tax administration space. We thank you, Mr. Chairman, for kicking off the Taxpayers First event that we held last year. That was fantastic. Our Taxpayer Defense Center continues to be very active in precedential litigation, but I'd like to focus on a couple of points here. Surprise, the IRS needs more money. It needed more prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, and if the IRA money for IRS is zeroed, we will have to scale up from there. However, point 2, the IRS must prioritize any additional funding it receives toward taxpayer services and modernization. 3, Congress, the IRS, and Treasury must develop a genuine, detailed strategic plan for that modernization with transparent benchmarks and accountability safeguards if those benchmarks aren't achieved. And 4, the damaged system of IRS oversight needs to be repaired so that Congress has more partners in ensuring the funding is properly spent. Now, there are lots of illustrations over the history of IRS modernization that I can go into. Hopefully we will when we get more technical in the Q&A period. But I'd like to point out 2 comparison and contrasts here. The IRS Restructuring and Reform Act of 1998, that was the product of 2 years of commission work, hundreds of testimonies, multiple committee hearings, and a 184-page bill. Set up that tripartite system of IRS oversight that ensured, for a few years at least, the service was actually transforming, meeting the objectives of its strategic plan. That system began to weaken, which I'll discuss a bit later, but that was generally a success. Contrast this with the Inflation Reduction Act, which took all of 9 paragraphs to describe an agency transformation, 3 paragraphs to describe how 99% of the funds would be spent. This was not a real transformation. It was an attempt to meet a score in the Inflation Reduction Act. That's what the funding was really intended for, and unfortunately, the strategic planning, the resulting strategic operational plan, and now the implementation roadmap, well, those came long after the money was let out the door, and it shows. It's folly to think that as we discuss estimates ranging from $180.4 billion to $316 billion for the collections the agency could get from the IRA funding, when, again, we were trying to meet a score, not modernize. We need to move forward with the real modernization here. And again, it's going to take money. There's no apparent project in the implementation roadmap for modernizing the individual master file or the business master file. Customer service priorities are starting to lag. These are a few reasons why our evaluation of the IRS's report card of IRA funds earned an overall D grade, and I'd be happy to explain further as to why that grade was given, but I'll just recommend here we need to restore the strength of that tripartite accountability system I mentioned going forward. If modernization is going to succeed, we have to have more itemized spending plans for the IRS going forward beyond the 100-odd page budget justification that members of Congress see. We have to have more detailed real-time data on service levels in the IRS. That will help us figure out where we need to shift personnel and how we can better use technologies like AI. And we have to measure the fiscal benefits of modernization and customer service on compliance. Several witnesses here can talk in greater detail about that as well as myself. But let me close this oral presentation with an important and inspiring quote. Even in the most difficult times, we can come together as a nation, as a people, and as a Congress to accomplish important things for the American people. That was said 5.5 years ago by the late, great John Lewis, who many of you know from this panel. History can repeat itself. It wasn't that long ago when you worked together to produce that legislation. Let's do it again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ladwa.
So, Chairman Schweikert, Ranking Member Sewell, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, my name is Minesh Ladwa, and it is an absolute honor to be here today from London to discuss this opportunity about modernizing the IRS to put technology at the forefront of modernization that drives economic growth, compliance efficiency, and taxpayer engagement. So with the right strategy, the IRS can become the world's leading tax authority, setting a global benchmark for modern tax administration. It's not just about compliance and enforcement. It's about ensuring that America's tax system remains competitive, scalable, and cost-efficient in the digital economy. So for nearly 2 decades, I have worked with tax agencies worldwide to modernize systems, implement AI-driven automation, and enhance compliance strategies. I've seen firsthand what works and what doesn't work. So governments across Europe and Asia are not building IT systems from scratch. They are leveraging commercially available, scalable IT solutions to increase efficiency, enhance compliance, and improve taxpayer engagement. So today I want to focus on 3 critical, I was going to call it actions, but I would say suggestions. Number 1, transforming the IRS into a technology-first agency, moving beyond fragmented, custom-built IT solutions. Number 2, leveraging AI, automation, and digital services to reduce administrative burdens whilst improving compliance. And number 3, implementing a modernization in a phased, controlled manner, ensuring seamless revenue connection and taxpayer services. This is how we do it, and I want to share some ideas. So one of the biggest challenges tax agencies face globally is data fragmentation, disconnected systems, and inconsistent taxpayer records, and inefficiencies that increase compliance risks and costs. So there is a better way. So I like to think about a real-time AI-enabled tax platform that can provide things like 360-degree views of the taxpayer obligations, automate things like case management and call center, reducing manual reviews and errors whilst improving accuracy. Enable digital self-service tools, making compliance easier and faster. So how do you do it? Where do you begin with the scale that the IRS is? So one option for consideration, rather than a full-scale transformation, is taking a pragmatic approach. I would suggest we prototype, we leverage good taxpayers, big, large corporations that are willing to participate in pilot programs. We sometimes focus on, hey, let's solve, the big master file problem. Well, yes, it's a big issue, but how do we begin in a way that we don't have risk to revenue, but we can pilot these new programs with commercially available solutions? So if modernization is implemented effectively, here's what I believe the IRS could achieve and what I've seen sort of globally from around the globe. Potential anything between 5 to 40% improvement in tax debt collection using AI-driven compliance solutions. So I've been reading some stats, over 600 billion net tax gap, just a 5% of that would be about 30 billion, in tax debt collection. 8 to 12% reduction in IT costs, eliminating things like outdated systems, and hopefully an automation of over 170 tax administration processes. I am going to say that modernization tax systems must not come at the expense of security or taxpayer trust. That's why leading tax agencies using secure cloud-based solutions that meet things like FedRAMP standards, ISO standards, that ensures that the IRS remains in full control of tax data. So, my final thought. Chairman Schweikert, Ranking Member Sewell, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. The IRS stands at a pivotal crossroads, so modernization isn't a choice, it's an economic necessity. The opportunity in front of us is to turn the IRS into the intelligent AI-driven tax agency that provides unified taxpayer views, internally and externally, uses AI and automation to enhance compliance, and delivers seamless digital taxpayer services. By adopting proven, commercially available solutions, the opportunity is now for the IRS to modernize at scale, becoming the global benchmark for technology-first tax administration, and setting a new standard for efficient, intelligent governance that serves the American people. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to your questions later. Thank you.
Chairman Schweikert, Ranking Member Sewell, and members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to participate in today's hearing. I have been asked here today to discuss the Department of Treasury's payment process and related systems. Treasury operates and maintains systems that are critical to the government's financial infrastructure. This includes the disbursements of payments to the American public and businesses, the collection of taxes and revenues, and the borrowing of funds necessary to run the federal government. The general fund of the U.S. government is the reporting entity responsible for accounting for the cash activity of the federal government. The Secretary of the Treasury has delegated management of the general fund to the Bureau of the Fiscal Service. In fiscal year 2022, the general fund reported $23.2 trillion of cash inflows, primarily debt issuances and tax collections, and $22.8 trillion of cash outflows, primarily debt repayments. My statement today discusses our understanding of the payment process as they relate to the general fund and knowledge of the audit activities over the payment systems. This statement is based primarily on work we performed as part of our financial statement audit of the fiscal year 2022 schedules of the general fund. We are currently auditing the fiscal year 2024 schedules of the general fund, and we plan to issue that report in March of this year. Our fiscal year 2022 report provides more detailed information on the objectives, scope, and methodology for our audit. We conducted the work in which the statement is based in accordance with generally accepted government auditing standards. Those standards require that we plan and perform the audit to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence to provide a reasonable basis for our findings and conclusions based on our audit objectives, and we believe that our audit evidence provides a reasonable basis for our findings and conclusions. We audited the fiscal year 2022 schedules of the general fund because of their significance to the consolidated financial statements of the U.S. government. The Secretary of the Treasury, in coordination with the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, is required to annually submit audited financial statements for the executive branch of the U.S. government to the President and Congress. GAO is required to audit these statements. Our most recent report on the U.S. government's consolidated financial statements discusses progress that has been made, but also underscores that much work remains to improve federal financial management and that the federal government continues to face an unsustainable long-term fiscal path. We continue to encounter limitations that prevented us from expressing an opinion on the fiscal year 22 schedule of the general fund or on fiscal services' internal control over financial reporting relative to the schedules. We have provided recommendations to fiscal service to address these limitations in their financial reporting processes. Treasury agreed with our recommendations and has plans to address them. We will provide an update on their status in our fiscal year 2024 report. Our audit procedures included obtaining an understanding of the federal payment process and related internal controls over financial reporting relevant to our audits. The U.S. government disperses cash payments for various reasons. This includes federal debt redemptions and interest, federal income tax refunds, benefit payments, vendor and salary payments, and other miscellaneous payments. The majority of federal entities, such as individual departments and agencies, process their payments through Fiscal Services Treasury dispersing offices. These federal entities internally review and approve payments to be made and submit certified payment schedules to Fiscal Service using Fiscal Service systems. Federal entities are responsible for maintaining the detailed information supporting their payment transactions and related internal controls, such as controls designed to prevent improper payments, including fraud. Fiscal Service then processes the payment schedules via several system applications and submits payment files to the Federal Reserve to make the payments, which are primarily electronic fund transfers. Fiscal Service's processes include certain edit and format checks, which can include checking scheduled payments against certain information in the Do Not Pay portal. After payments are made, various Fiscal Service systems capture payment information for accounting and reporting purposes. Since our initial audit of the schedules of the general fund, we have conducted limited audit procedures over information system controls. These included procedures related to access controls, configuration management, and security management. During the course of our audit, we also considered the results of relevant information system controls performed as part of Treasury's consolidated audit. In addition to audit procedures performed as part of recurring financial audits, Treasury's Office of Inspector General annually evaluates the effectiveness of Treasury's systems in accordance with the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. Chairman Schweikert, Ranking Member Sewell, and members of the subcommittee, this completes my prepared statement. I would be pleased to respond to questions that you may have.
Chairman Schweikert, Ranking Member Sewell, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this hearing today and inviting me to testify on IRS return on investment and modernization. I view these topics through the lens of taxpayer rights. Rich or poor, multinational or small business, native-born or immigrant, U.S. taxpayers deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Because taxpayer dignity is closely correlated with taxpayers' trust of the tax agency and willingness to comply with the tax laws, taxpayer rights protections will not only increase taxpayer trust, but also increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the tax system. The IRS is a large organization that touches nearly every person and business entity in the United States. Yet its operations have been mired in mid-20th century processes and technology that create inefficiencies and frustrate taxpayers and IRS employees alike. The IRS has over 60 case management systems, so there is no 360-degree picture of the taxpayer's data, interactions, and filings with the IRS. This situation creates significant inefficiencies. Phone assisters cannot access certain databases and therefore cannot help the taxpayer in real time. IRS case selection does not reflect all the information available in IRS systems and databases, leading to no-change audits and false positives. Documentation taxpayers have sent in is not available for review by the employee with whom they are speaking. The sheer waste of taxpayer and IRS employee time is both infuriating and costly. According to the Inspector General, however, with IRA funding, the IRS IT organization, quote, is making significant technical advances in the areas of AI, automation, cloud capabilities, data access, data quality, and data standards. The IRS is undergoing multiple new processes, and once fully operational, they will pave the way for a new technology era across the enterprise, end quote. In my 50 years of working in tax, I've never seen an IG report praise the IRS like this. Through 2024, using IRA funding, there has been significant improvements to taxpayer service on the phones and online account, to the fairness of the tax system by focusing on areas of complex non-compliance, and to efficiency and effectiveness through digitalization. Digitalization requires both the retention of employees who have institutional knowledge and hands-on experience in tax administration, and the hiring of new employees who bring new skills and outside the agency experience. The balance between seasoned employees and those with new skill sets will not be achieved if government service is vilified and current IRS employees are painted as inept or even worse, corrupt. Moreover, with a tax code as complex as ours, digitalization cannot replace in-person assistance. In many instances, human judgment and intervention are required. Through June 2024, the IRS spent $1.4 billion, or 44.3% of IRS funding, dedicated to taxpayer service. If the IRS continues to apply IRA funding to make up for the annual appropriation gap, it projects it will run out of IRA taxpayer service funding at the end of this fiscal year. That means that taxpayers will experience a cliff. In one filing season, they are able to get through on the phone and have their returns processed relatively quickly. In the next filing season, we will back to pandemic levels of assistance, that is, almost no assistance at all. This path is unsustainable and violates the trust of U.S. taxpayers. I close my testimony with the fundamental right to confidentiality of returns and return information. Indeed, the efficiency and effectiveness of our self-assessment tax system is dependent on taxpayers' trust that information they voluntarily provide the IRS will be held confidential. Congress has recognized that tax returns and tax return information can be very helpful in administering non-tax administration policies, but every single exception to confidentiality in the code contains language restricting such use and disclosure, quote, for the purpose of and only to the extent necessary, end quote, for carrying out that non-tax administration purpose. Congress has only granted exceptions to 6103, where it has carefully balanced the compelling need for disclosure against the fundamental taxpayer guarantee that if they voluntarily provide the IRS with personal and private information, it will remain confidential. We all need to ensure that protection and right is not violated. Thank you.
Thank you to our witnesses. Now we begin the fun part. We try to educate those of us sitting up here. Ms. And I apologize for everyone. Koselleck. Maybe the single thickest 5 minutes I think we've ever had someone sitting there. But I want to walk through just a couple things, get my head around. Are you familiar with RAAS, Research Applied Analytics and Statistics Division?
I am not.
Okay, apparently they're the ones that are supposed to do certain data. They also do apparently data sharing agreements for researchers. Apparently right now there are more than 50 researchers that have that type of access. So, and part of my reason for this is, I know the pop culture right now is to attack Doge and those things, but the fact of the matter is the data we have says there's 50 researchers. How do you think groups on the left and the right write their, reports on so-and-so are being picked on or so-and-so aren't paying enough? But we also have letters going back a couple of years, and you touched on this, that for those who do have access for research, that we probably need additional protocols for privacy and security. Because it turns out right now, from what we're finding in our own quick research, which took us a half an hour, that 50 researchers out there actually look like they have more access over history than the current DOGE process does. So that will be fun to dig into and figure out what's true and what is pop culture. What if you, am I on track?
So what I can say about access to sensitive systems, certainly there is an expectation that anybody collecting sensitive information, tax information, any kind of information.
Well, my point was just, are you familiar with the fact that we're coming up with over 50 different research groups have access already?
Yes, and there should be agreements in place, so that's what I was getting at.
Okay.
Anytime there's someone with access to information, there are policies that are expected to be followed, yes.
Could I beg of you, for probably all of us out here who
Yes.
have an interest in that, please, can we just grab some of that and send it our direction?
Absolutely.
And you made a comment that, was it in the 22 audit, that you almost weren't able to complete that? Could you put some more information around that?
Yep. So on both the general fund audit and on the consolidated financial statements audit of the U.S. government, GAO is unable to express an opinion on the financial statements, given various limitations in data available. At the general fund level, much of the information that's in the systems, like I said, details are maintained at agencies, and summary information is in some of the systems, and that prevents us from having the detailed information that would allow us to provide an opinion on the financial statements and the line items there. At the consolidated financial statement level, there are several reasons we're not able to give an opinion on those statements. One being challenges at the Department of Defense, in them being able to have good financial management systems and processes in place. The second being the ability of the government to eliminate transactions between each other, and then the third being in the consolidation process. So there are a variety of reasons that we are unable to give opinions on the statements, yes.
Okay, and for years I've been trying to get an AI audit of the Pentagon just to, because they failed now 8 years. Now it turns out we should probably do the same with the IRS. Mr. Ladwa, could your system solve GAO's problem?
I think we would have to look at the intricacies without a resounding yes or a no. I think there are sort of lots of complexities and processes between what I've just heard in order to do that. I would say there are, as I said, solutions that we provide that look at things like that to provide those.
Well, Ms. Olson pointed out something that I'm surprised none of the rest of you did. 60 different sort of tracking systems for the individual taxpayer. You've done this now in other countries. How would you, if we reached out to you and said, fix it, how do you deal with that?
So I think there was a few conversations around this master file that I've read a little bit about and know a little bit about the architecture in terms of tracking and audit. I think if I was going to tackle it and think about how you solve this problem, it's about consolidation and understanding where the data is, how it's being stored, how it's being accessed. And my first thing would be understanding and moving away from sort of old, archaic, custom-built file systems like this. That's the first, to ensure that we've got a consolidated taxpayer record.
Okay. And for those of us who are not very bright, would you build a mirror, run the systems, run them parallel, and then do a switchover? I mean, how do you do the migration, and how quickly could migration actually happen?
So I think the first and foremost is that, for example, the complexity of the master file system, from what I understand, has a lot of detailed information about the taxpayer, right? Obligations, the previous history, and various other sort of artifacts. Would I mirror it? Would I do, what's the migration period? I would first start with a fresh level of thinking. So first I would understand what's important when we're administering the various taxes at this federal level. That's needed for a transparent taxpayer journey and the efficiencies internally of the tax agency. Because there are solutions which basically consolidate and that you can deploy very, very quickly. Then it becomes a question of historic. So do I need to look at the intricacies of what's in the master file now to bring it over? I would essentially, mirroring is probably, I would say, it could be a consideration. I would say we would look at, if we were going to do this again from scratch, how would we do it, rather than rely on, how we've built things in the past.
Okay, perfect. Couple others, just because these are idiosyncrasies. So even with the stepped-up funding, and this was a little different, the facts I'm holding here in my data set, and actually from a press release from the IRS itself, during the tax season, only 31% of the phone calls were actually being answered. If I came to you today and said, I need you to design me a hyper-accurate, hyper-friendly, so my mom calls, bless her soul, but it calls, and IRS chatbot stays on the phone, helps you fill out the form, maybe sends you a text message of the YouTube video of how to do the form, maybe a PDF if you don't have the form. Instead of a world where only 31% of the phone calls are being answered, and then I have the whole statistics here of how many of the responses are actually not accurate on those calls. How difficult would be that type of outreach technologically?
Chairman, I don't think it's that difficult. I don't think it has to be
Just
that.
stop right there. That was
Yeah.
a brilliant answer. No, please, go on. Because this is a fixation, because first off, that's not right or left, it's just decency.
Yeah, and I like to take tax administration right down to its basics, right? It's understanding what you need to populate and then populating it and then processing it. So in order to help, there are solutions that exist which do exactly those types of things, right? So when you're depending on the channel, you can absolutely, guide and do it effectively as long as you know exactly who the taxpayer is and what they're trying to file based upon their, previous history or them as an individual. It's not that hard.
If I came to you, and this is one for anyone that would have comfort, Ms. Sewell and I have had this running conversation for years on, let's first just use certain quartiles, earned income tax credit populations. Past years, they delayed it by 2 months because of the amount of fraud of duplicate, tax forms were being put in. But that also ends up being a population now that will get multiple letters of inquiry. It's technically not audits, but please explain this to us. We've had a data scientist in our office a couple of years ago who basically said, if you just did a data match, you could wipe out the fraud because the quality, and it could be blinded public databases, commercial databases. If I came to you right now and said, I have a population here which qualifies under the law for an earned income tax credit. We want to get rid of the 2-month delay, but we want to eliminate the fake, the fraudulent tax forms being turned in trying to steal someone else's credit. You do that through an AI algorithm, a data bounce off commercially available databases. How do you solve both of our problems? Fixation of fraud, the morality of people getting something they're earned faster. Walk me through real quickly how you solve both of our problems.
It's a great question. We've got 2 hours, right? So first and foremost, Chairman, I think the understanding before we talk about technology, yes, technology exists to be able to use things like machine learning algorithms, configurable business rules to be able to detect patterns, to understand who are our highest risk customers, should refunds be made, things like receipt submissions in terms of extractions and understanding what someone is claiming is what they are due. So I think first and foremost, the technology is there, it exists. I think the question would be is what are the rules and what are the sort of legal and policies that allow us to configure those rules in order to quickly be able to identify those?
Right. My eccentricities have been dominating this too far. Ms. Sewell.
So my initial questions are to our managing director of GAO. And I really do want very simple yes or no, because I only have 5 minutes and there are a lot of things I want to cover. So my first question is that, well, it's really not really a question. It's yesterday in the New York Times, 5 former Treasury secretaries wrote an op-ed entitled, "Our Democracy is Under Siege." Without objection, I would like to submit this article op-ed for the record.
Without objection.
In the op-ed, the former Treasury secretaries noted that the nation's payment systems has historically been operated by a very small group of nonpartisan career civil servants until recently, when that norm was upended. They also expressed significant data privacy, cybersecurity, and national security threats with, quote, political actors from the so-called Department of Government Efficiency being involved. I, too, am quite concerned about the privacy of my constituents and American taxpayers being accessed. So my question, yes or no, does GAO know what confidential tax or sensitive information was accessed and shared with DOJ? Yes or no?
No, we do not.
So GAO does not know what was shared. Please answer yes or no. Does GAO know who accessed the data or what code was rewritten?
No, we have not done work on that.
So I understand that there are audit laws that keep track of who accessed the payment systems. Can you answer yes or no? Is it possible for management to override controls in place and delete those audit logs?
Logs are designed to, and I want to just mention the concept of segregation of duties. So when access is granted,
I
there
only
should be
have a
different
few minutes,
people
so yes
to
or
do the
no, ma'am.
audit logs.
You can say you don't know.
Yeah, we can get back to you. Generally, you'd have someone separate from who creates the audit logs monitoring them.
So, Ms. Olson, please answer yes or no. Is there confidential taxpayer information protected by Section 6103 in the Treasury payment systems?
Yes.
Do you know what confidential taxpayer information is in the Treasury payment systems? Yes or no?
Yes, at very least.
So, Ms. Olson, I'm very concerned that this DOJ and unelected folks who have access to these payment informations. As the previous national taxpayer advocate, do you share my concerns? And what do you think I should say to my constituents who are really afraid that their taxpayer information, their confidential private information is being exposed? Now, I do know that the managing director did say that there may have been like 50 or so researchers that would, but they had contracts that specifically required them to keep that confidential private information confidential and private. So can you talk to us a little bit about that concern? And then I want to ask you, how do we address this with no budget for the IRS to actually do what it's supposed to do? I think everybody on this panel has said a couple of things. First, that the IRS needs to be reformed. And secondly, that the IRS has an outdated technology system, and we have to update it. All of those things take cost, and I'd like to know your concerns and how you would address them.
Well, I'm very concerned about anyone accessing confidential taxpayer information. I'm a confidentiality hawk in that regard. And I think that if the law is followed, then the inappropriate people will not get access to that. There are criminal sanctions for improper inspection and disclosure. The issue is, how do you detect that? And that's really something that not only is for GAO and the Inspector General to look at, but also Congress to make sure that
Inspector
that's
General,
happening.
I think all of them have been summarily I think the Inspector Generals have been summarily dismissed
Right,
by this
but that
administration.
is their function, to look at fraud, waste, and abuse. I also think that there should be notification procedures, where someone's information has been accessed improperly, and that would give someone the right, an individual or any taxpayer, the right to sue in a private cause of action, either the federal government employee or an independent contractor or any person, is what the law says. The problem is getting that disclosure, and that's what's serious right now. We don't know.
I'm running out of time, and I think what you're saying is we need more transparency in government and accountability in government. I think all of us agree that that the IRS can do it more efficiently and more effectively, but I just want this committee to know we cannot do it when funds are frozen and we're not giving access to the IRS to actually complete any of these tools. I, like the chairman, do agree that certain populations, I feel, are targeted for audits They are low-hanging fruit. There are people who literally don't make more than $50,000 a year. Using the earned income tax credit, they are able to decrease their liability. And that's fair, but why are they 4 times more likely to be audited than some complicated tax return? Having said that, I look forward to this committee, working on this committee to address the concerns that have been laid out by all of our witnesses on the panel. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you very much. And pursuant to committee practice, we will now move to 2-to-1 questioning, and I recognize Chairman Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair Fishbach. That's a great thing to say. The Congressional Budget Office has a track record of wildly missing the mark when it comes to projecting economic and fiscal outcomes. In 2022, Democrats gave the IRS an $80 billion windfall that CBO initially projected would bring in $200 billion in revenue. Not surprisingly, the CBO has been proven wrong again in this point. The IRS has missed CBO's initial revenue projection from enhanced IRS resources by 56%, which adds up to billions of dollars. Mr. DeBlois, I was in the back office watching your testimony, and you were speaking my language because you are dead right, dead on with the failures of joint tax and CBO, because they work hand in glove when it comes to tax policy. They have proven to be wrong, whether it's the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 or whether it was the Inflation Reduction Act. They were off by hundreds of billions and in some cases trillions of dollars in their scores. And if we as lawmakers have to make decisions based on CBO and joint taxes analysis, you betcha it better be right, and it hasn't been. So, Mr. DeBlois, as you know, part of today's hearing is focusing on the return on investment from the Inflation Reduction Act. Based on your previous research related to CBO projections and government funding, why do you think CBO has been so incorrect on their projections?
Well, thank you for the question, Chairman Smith. I think you're exactly right. Specifically regarding their accuracy on the Inflation Reduction Act and the enhanced enforcement efforts, I think it's pretty clear CBO dramatically overstated the efficiency of the IRS. It's readily apparent when considering the estimated ROI they had for the enhanced enforcement effort returns compared to the actual ROI, which is off by a factor of 6-fold just for fiscal year 2024. The actual ROI is less than 1, meaning for every $1 in revenue gained through the enhanced enforcement efforts, the IRS has already spent more than $1 to gain that. But consider today, and I know you've spoken to this in the past, under the CBO's broken model, if Congress were to rescind this slush fund to the IRS, they would assume that the deficit would increase. In reality, I think it's pretty clear that an $80 billion fund to the IRS isn't all that helpful towards deficit reduction, and the early results seem to suggest that. I would add more broadly, as I mentioned in my testimony, I think CBO does contain an implicit bias of underestimating the costs of increasing the size of government and overstating the costs associated with tax relief. This is due to a number of factors, from incorrect assumptions about welfare enrollment, the pace of economic recoveries, organic revenue growth that is generated when you give substantial tax cuts to the middle class. And I think these errors reflect this implicit bias that requires, on CBO's part, some serious self-reflection in order to make sure we don't make the same mistakes again in the future.
Thank you. Mr. Sepp, first off, welcome back to the best committee in Congress.
I agree.
Thank you. This is why you're invited back. No, we appreciate you being here to share your expertise as it relates to the modernization efforts at the IRS. We have read your organization's report, which gave the IRS a D grade for modernization. Can you share with the committee more about the IRS's history of modernization efforts, and what is the biggest factor that led to giving the agency a D in their modernization efforts?
Glad to do so. The history of IRS modernization really dates back to the 1950s. There was an interesting headline in Time magazine in 1962 that the IRS is developing a computerized system of taxpayer records that will frighten the living daylights out of taxpayers. Since then, we've had various modernization programs under acronyms like IRP, TISM, TAS, TSR, all kinds of different modernization systems that have ballooned in costs dramatically, sometimes doubling in cost and falling behind. We're witnessing that now with the replacement of the individual master file. Back in 2009, the IRS had projected that this project would take until 2028 to complete. What's the date now? It's still 2028. Did the infusion of funding from IRA have any impact on that? Were they falling behind and it's allowing them just barely to keep up? We don't really know that because the metrics aren't adequate. That's one thing that went into the D grade in our report, and we've brought copies of it along by my colleague Debbie Jennings, who contributed very well to this testimony, along with Damian Brady. But there are other elements in the overall grade of D. The IRS actually did better in simplifying notices, letters, and forms, a B grade. I think that reflects some of what Nina had said. TIGTA is praising some of these modernization efforts, but in others, like I just said, progress in scanning technologies, customer service technologies, they're still not making the grade. We've got to help them do better.
Thank you. Any American who has spent 1 minute interacting with the IRS knows the agency desperately needs to be modernized. But the main goal behind modernization ought to be improving the taxpayer experience, not just giving an agency with a horrible track record of betraying the trust of taxpayers billions of more dollars in additional funds to hire more people and increase audits. Mr. Ladwa, in your opinion as an expert in tax administration with nearly 2 decades of experience in modernizing tax agencies across the world, what can the IRS do to modernize its operations, and where does the IRS rank compared to other tax agencies when it comes to utilizing new technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning?
Thank you, Chairman. I also would like to be invited back. I think we touched upon it in terms of, if I first start with taxpayer experience. And I think in order to get the best taxpayer experience, I think we need transparency and real-time transparency, not waiting to see, once I've submitted a tax return, what the amount I owe or am due is. In order to do that, we have to start with modernizing the databases that hold these types of customer records, the taxpayer records. We call them customers in the UK. I think, how does the IRS rank in terms of AI and modernization in general? I think I've seen from working with different countries that the first real sort of journey that people go on is actually recognizing that they need to modernize. Some countries don't even recognize that they need to modernize. I'm aware that there are sort of AI prototypes and things going on, but I think in parallel to deploying tactical solutions on top of old architectures, I think there needs to be a real review. My colleague next to me said the same thing in terms of really holding how we move away from the old COBOL-based systems into newer technologies, as well as deploying AI capabilities that can help increase tax revenue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Du Bois, Chairman Smith kind of got at it and was mentioning some of the CBOs overestimating and some of the biases. And, you know, I was just wondering if maybe you could expand on some of those, getting at more of those biases, and what are some of the other biases that you think CBO has demonstrated how do you think they shape those incorrect projections and recognizing them, I guess? So just looking, maybe drill down a little bit more on what we were having the discussion with Chairman Smith.
Sure, happy to, Congresswoman. So, a couple things. I think if you look over the last 15 years at some of the most substantial pieces of legislation that have been placed before Congress, whether it's the 2009 stimulus bill, the Affordable Care Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, we see an error rate that is alarming, because it means that Congress is not being equipped with the information they need to make accurate decisions at the time they're voting on legislation, because the actual costs associated with that legislation differs so substantially from the fiscal reality that occurs. And as I alluded to in my testimony, what's most concerning to me is that those errors frequently tend to be on the side of a fiscal mistake that underestimates the cost of new or increased government programs and overestimates the cost associated with tax relief. We've seen it time and time again with legislation after legislation. Now, if I were the CBO, I would be thinking, how can we adjust some of our assumptions about things like the IRS's ROI? How can we not make the same mistake that we did about welfare benefits when we looked at the post-2009 recession economic recovery and it turned out to be record slow? What can we do to make sure we don't make those mistakes again? I would hope those conversations are happening at the CBO's level, but I'm concerned that they're not, and I'm concerned that even the baseline itself that Congress uses that CBO uses to inform Congress is itself containing flaws that will continue to lead Congress down a road towards making inaccurate decisions because it's based on inaccurate information.
And maybe without going into it too much, do you think that Congress needs to take action to make some of those things happen that you're...
Yeah, I think two things. First, I would take scores with somewhat of a grain of salt, number one. Number two, I think Congress should seriously look at amending the requirements for how the baseline is constructed, and also think about viewing it differently. I mean, I very briefly alluded in my testimony to whether we look at a current law or current policy baseline. This shouldn't be controversial. It should be bipartisan. When the Bush tax cuts were up for expiration in the early 2010s, it was the Obama administration who was advocating for a current policy baseline. I think considering a current policy baseline in light of conversations around reconciliation is the right way to go, and yet CBO is continuing to use a current law baseline. So I think we need to have those conversations, and Congress should play a very important role in that.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Sepp, Chairman Smith did kind of get at modernization and a little more broadly, and I wanted to ask you, a little bit about the direct file return and the Inflation Reduction Act contained $15 million for them to study the feasibility and costs of establishing the direct file program. Yet the Biden administration overstepped its authority and created the pilot program, which cost the IRS around $129 million without congressional approval. Do you agree that Congress did not authorize the establishment of the direct file program in the IRA?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And the IRS had previously indicated that they are considering expanding the program. Given the over $900 per filer, they spent in 2024, do you think this would provide a good return on investment for taxpayers?
No, because there are other imperatives that the IRS could be using these resources for. Let's pick a number. It's between $114 billion, which is what the IRS said it set aside first year of direct file, million, and $250 million to run the system a year. That's the high-end projection. Let's take a middle one at $200 million a year for direct file going forward over a 10-year period of time. $2 billion. Now, the service has said that it needs an additional $3 billion for modernization outside of what was given in IRA. Shift it out of direct file and you're 2/3 of the way there in meeting that. Or take a look at low-income tax clinics and the volunteer income tax assistance program, the elderly tax counseling program. Combined, that's about $80 million a year. You could more than double the funding for those organizations which serve moderate and low-income taxpayers rather than direct file. I mean, those are choices Congress should be considering right now.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Fishbach. Ms. Chu.
Ms. Olson, thank you for your 18 years of service as our country's national taxpayer advocate. You know this system inside out. And one of your accomplishments as taxpayer advocate was working with the IRS to adopt the Taxpayer Bill of Rights to more clearly articulate taxpayers' rights to the public and the IRS. And one of those 10 rights is the right to confidentiality, in which it says, taxpayers have the right to expect that any information they provide to the IRS will not be disclosed unless authorized by the taxpayer or by law. Taxpayers have the right to expect the IRS to investigate and take appropriate action against its employees, return preparers, and others who wrongfully use or disclose taxpayer return information. Well, taxpayers entrust the IRS with their most sensitive information, and Congress has gone to great lengths to ensure that it be kept safe and treated with respect. In fact, you asked us to imagine what would happen to that trust and to voluntary compliance if taxpayers' confidential information is inspected or disclosed by actors outside of the IRS. And yet, we have Elon Musk's so-called Department of Government Efficiency, which has gained access to the Treasury's Bureau of Fiscal Service, the sensitive payment system responsible for paying out more than $6 trillion in benefits, tax refunds, Treasury bonds, and other payments each year. And what that means is that unvetted, unaccountable billionaires and their staff could access people's Social Security numbers, bank information, and tax returns, which are protected under Section 6103 of the tax code. Can you specify the types of confidential taxpayer information that is in the payment system that is endangered through this action? And also, can you imagine for us what the consequences are to the voluntary system of taxpayer compliance with this action?
Well, the very basic information that's available is the taxpayer's name, the taxpayer's identity, the amount of their address, their Social Security number, the amount of the refund, the type of tax that the refund relates to, the type, the year. If BFS is issuing a levy or doing an offset, you have all of that information, what the total debt is, et cetera. This is very personal information and can be very damaging to taxpayers. The fact that there is a debt that you have is something that is closely guarded unless the IRS has decided to file a notice of federal tax lien, and that is a very considered opinion, considered decision.
And I want you to imagine what would happen to taxpayer compliance.
Well, I personally believe that confidentiality is core at why taxpayers agree to send in and self-assess, let me repeat, self-assess their tax liabilities on the 1040 or whatever income tax return they're using. And if they believe that that information is widely disseminated throughout other federal agencies or state agencies or local agencies, then this will actually be a bar to people. It will chill people reporting information.
Ms. Olson, the Trump administration sent an email to almost all federal employees, including IRS employees, about a so-called deferred resignation, but in reality, this was an attempt to pressure and coerce civil servants into quitting. What impact will that have on taxpayers who rely on the IRS, and will these coerced job cuts and firings even save the taxpayers' money?
Well, I am concerned about the IRS workforce and my former employees, and I think what I said in my testimony, that in order to do true modernization, you have to retain the people who have institutional knowledge while you're bringing on more people. And trying to just willy-nilly disappear people or get them to retire means that you will very likely get the most talented people leaving because they can find their places in the private sector. So what you've done is a brain drain from the IRS, which will mean that modernization will not occur with that knowledge. Outside contractors cannot bring that internal knowledge of tax administration and the tax system, no matter how talented they are.
And will it save us money?
I doubt it in the long run.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Olson, do you have any evidence that confidential taxpayer data has actually been illegally accessed or illegally disclosed?
As GAO has said, we have not seen that. That's part of the problem, that there is no transparency.
So we have
on this.
absolutely seen no evidence that that has happened, even though we've heard it today.
I
Except
personally
for the
have
fact
not
that we
seen
actually
that.
had existing IRS policies that allowed security measures to fail, that prevented an employee from unauthorizing access and leaking the tax returns of Donald Trump and approximately 76 other individuals way before we ever even saw Elon Musk take an interest in this. We do know that that happened.
You know what? I know that IRS employees are trained from day one about
But we do know,
confidentiality
I'm going
of
to
return
take my time back,
information.
Ms. Olson. I thank you very much.
And if I may
Ms. Olson, thank you
continue.
very much. But in stark contrast, Elon Musk's approach to this is about transparency. It's about open systems. And when we say transparency in government, it doesn't mean that allowing rogue employees to weaponize confidential records. It actually means creating systems where access is properly monitored, security logged, and justified with clear oversight. The IRS scandal demonstrates what happens when unaccountable bureaucrats control private citizen data with very little transparency or consequences. Musk's vision, by contrast, and he has been very clear about this, as is President Trump's vision, it represents a future where government efficiency is achieved through technological safeguards, open auditing mechanisms, and a commitment to individual privacy. So as much as we have heard all of these things about an unelected member of our community having access, we've seen what's happened when unelected bureaucrats have access. And we have seen thousands of information on taxpayers, and I would argue on Republican or highly conservative members of our society, have been leaked. That is a fact. That has happened.
May I
So
respond?
I actually have a statement I would like to make, but if you want to respond in writing later on, I would appreciate that. But I do want to get back to the point of this entire hearing, which I would hope both sides would want to do that. In conversations with North Texans, I have repeatedly heard complaints regarding the IRS persistent delays, their poor customer service and lack of responsiveness and transparency. And ironically, we continue to hear claims that the IRS just needs more funding to improve. But the fact is that when the government agency was given a significantly larger budget, it doubled its employee count, customer service actually declined, but harassment of law-abiding American taxpayers increased. And rather than focusing on improving the core functions of the IRS, the previous administration spent their time and our money creating misguided and expensive pet projects like the new direct file scheme. In its 2024 annual report to Congress, the National Taxpayer Advocate found that it took the IRS almost 2 years to resolve identity theft cases and issue refunds to victims. The advocate noted that, quote, these delays impacted nearly 500,000 taxpayers and were even worse than the delays seen in FY 2023. The delays were deemed unconscionable by the taxpayer advocate, and I could not agree more. In addition to an egregious delays in the processing of ERTC claims, delays in the processing of regular tax returns have hurt people across our country, especially small businesses and their most basic operations of the IRS. It must be modernized to better serve and protect small businesses. And I think that's exactly where you see the focus of this administration. Ms. Sepp, would you agree, or Mr. Sepp, would you agree that the IRS should focus on its congressionally mandated functions before embarking on questionable initiatives like the direct file program?
Absolutely, it should. There are many priorities that should be in the front of the line here. And touching on this cybersecurity question, which we haven't really explored in detail, GAO has warned that the IRS lacks an oversight structure to protect taxpayer data from cyber as well as internal threats since 2018. And so how do we approach that comprehensively? I think it's a first things first kind of operation. We have to look at individual master file, business master file, cybersecurity, and devote the resources there.
Thank you very much. And Mr. DeBlois, as has been mentioned, CBO failed to accurately project the amount of revenue that IRA funding would bring into the IRS, suggesting that perhaps the funding was not properly used on enhanced enforcement efforts in this instance. What can be done to improve the IRS's return on investment, and is it really enhanced enforcement efforts, or is it something else?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. I would say doubling down on the enhanced enforcement efforts would be a mistake. That's what caused the mess, so to speak, and I think evaluating the fundamental assumption that these enforcement efforts are a good idea is something we need to do. It's not just bad fiscal estimates and a poor ROI, it's the reality that these collection efforts are going to hit middle-class Americans. So collectively, I think Congress needs to reevaluate this $80 billion venture, realize it was a mistake that shouldn't be repeated, but also relieve the IRS of that funding and engage in better activities in the first place.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Ms. Malotakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to use my time to highlight a real critical problem that has been facing my constituents, and that is the issue of stolen IRS checks. This has cost my constituents alone millions of dollars. And in 2022, there was $4.7 billion that was purposed for IRS business system modernization. The IRS's need for information technology modernization is critical, with the potential to reallocate IRA funds from enforcement to IT improvements. It's a key priority of the newly established Department of Government Efficiency. The IRS plays a critical role in ensuring taxpayers receive their hard-earned refunds securely and efficiently. However, outdated IT infrastructure and delivery systems have left many vulnerable to fraud and stolen tax reimbursement checks. In my district alone, 377 cases of stolen checks totaling $5,399,808 to be exact. Nationally, it has been reported that the IRS, that for IRS checks alone, approximately 40,000 checks have been stolen in 2024, up from just 100 in 2022. So obviously, we're going backwards, despite the funding that was put in place for IT modernization. The numbers are getting worse. The value stolen has been approximately $1 billion, as well as the hardship and stress that the intended recipients have had to endure as they seek to get their checks. Modernizing these systems is no longer optional. It is necessary to protect taxpayers, enhance efficiency, and reduce fraud. And we know the fraudsters are always ahead of the game, right? They're 2 steps ahead. By investing in secure digital payment options, real-time tracking, and enhanced verification measures, the IRS can better safeguard taxpayer funds and restore trust in the system. It's time for meaningful upgrades to ensure the agency meets the demands of the 21st century and prevent financial harm to American taxpayers. I was pleased to learn that the Bureau of Fiscal Service recently launched a pilot program to leverage existing technology and services offered by the U.S. Postal Service to track the transmittal of checks. And I also recently introduced the Recovery of Stolen Checks Act with my colleagues, Congresswoman Terry Sewell and Congressman David Kustoff. It's bipartisan legislation, it's common sense, and it would allow taxpayers who've had tax refunds stolen in the mail to receive a replacement check via direct deposit, which, believe it or not, has been incredibly difficult to get the IRS to move people to direct deposit so they don't become victims again. And my legislation will fix that. So the IRS's failure to modernize and adapt has led to a significant rise in stolen checks and billions in dollars in fraud, but despite these ongoing issues, the agency still lacks the ability to offer taxpayers that direct deposit option when their checks are stolen. And so I'll start, I guess, with Mr. Ladwa, but I'm happy to hear from anyone who wants to chime in. Based on your experience working with these tax agencies from around the world, can you speak to the impact that modernizing will have on preventing fraud and abuse? And if you have any particular example of an effort that has led to secure tax refunds.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So I think it's a It's an interesting listening to, the inherent problem we have with fraud here, especially when it comes to checks. The first thing I'll say with my experiences is that around the world, I've seen that tax agencies are phasing out checks more and more often to move to digital-based solutions, right, which essentially can speed up the refund process in a matter of sort of minutes or seconds with real-time sort of digital payments that happen or requests for refunds. Technologies exist which allow us, using things like machine learning, to categorize taxpayers, high-risk taxpayers, based upon previous behaviors, for example. So we know that if someone's requesting a refund, what is the sort of profile based upon prior submissions, based upon prior behavioral patterns? Have we sent them an enforcement letter before or some type of debt collection letter? Should we be having a human being audit this person before a refund be sent? So that's the first thing I'll say. In regards to specific references, I can get back to your staff in regards to...
Mr. Sepp, I saw you nodding your head. Do you have anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah.
If I might add something.
I would like for both of you to comment.
Okay.
If time allows, maybe
Yes.
a minute.
Let me just add, there is a parallel experience going on right now in development of Farm Bill reauthorization. Food stamp fraud is a real problem.
Also affecting
and
the district.
there are electronic payment solutions being discussed there, so you'd probably have some great synergy with members who are crafting that bill. The other thing I'd like to point out, Mr. Ladwa's experience and that of many other private sector individuals can and should be harnessed through something like the IRS Oversight Board that was created in the 1998 bill. It was tailor-made to bring private sector expertise to problems like these.
Ms. Olson, just within seconds.
Yeah, I was just going to say, for decades, I've recommended that Treasury create a debit card similar to what you have in Social Security, where people don't have bank accounts, they're unbanked, but they get their Social Security payments direct deposited on a debit card that has been negotiated by the U.S. government. And that is another solution to avoid some of these lost checks.
Thank you.
That's good. Thank you. Ms. Delbin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all our witnesses for being with us here today. At the direction of President Trump, Elon Musk, and the Doge, they've gained access to Americans' most sensitive personal data. President Trump and Elon Musk have clearly no respect for the rule of law. We've seen the IG fired, employees fired for disagreeing. In fact, I'd like to insert this article into the record titled, "The U.S. Treasury Claimed Doge Technologist Didn't Have Right Access When He Actually Did." Mr. Chairman, thank you. Elon Musk has called for the impeachment of the judge who blocked Doge's access to Treasury's database and has called for the president to defy judicial court orders. This is unprecedented, it's dangerous, and it's illegal. 5 former Treasury secretaries wrote about the dangers of providing unfettered access to our nation's payment systems to political actors like Musk and his team. Ms. Olson, thank you for all of your service. I wondered if you could talk about what events during the Nixon administration led to the major reform of what is now Section 6103, and what are the parallels between the events of nearly 50 years ago and those being taken by the Trump administration today? Your mic.
Before I do, I'd like to correct the record that Craig Littlejohn was not an IRS employee. He was, in fact, an IRS contractor, and he is serving time in jail for his unlawful leaking of individual taxpayer return and return information. So it was not the IRS employees who leaked that. Regarding 1970s, what happened was that prior to 1976 and the Tax Reform Act of 1976, the president controlled the decision-making as far as who had access to return and return information. So the Department of Agriculture asked for all return information and returns on all American farmers. And that triggered Congress to be very concerned. What were you doing with this information? Why were you getting this information? At the same time, there was concern about the White House using return information both to target enemies, but also to inquire and interfere with audits of allies of the White House. So that politicization of return information led Congress to flip, so that whereas before 76, the president and the executive branch controlled who had access to that information, 6103 says very clearly that return information is confidential, returns and return information is confidential, and it is not to be shared except by statute, namely where Congress describes where and how it's going to be shared and subject to what limitations.
Thank you. Can you speak to the importance of Treasury maintaining the disbursement of congressionally authorized payments and the risks of breaching a fundamental trust and suspending those funds?
Well, I just think this is very personal information, and if we're asking people to come in and give us their financial information so we don't have to spend billions of dollars seeking it and tracking people down, then it's very important that they know that that information is held closely to the government's chest and not shared willy-nilly around agencies, only for specific purposes that Congress has authorized.
And finally, how did the actions of the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, and Elon Musk threaten the fundamental rights of taxpayers, and how does that impact the efficiency of our tax system?
Well, see, that's very hard to answer because we don't know what they're doing. So we don't know if what they're doing is actually pursuant to a legally authorized exception or it's not. And that's where we have to have greater transparency on this. And I think the question marks are creating uncertainty and concern among taxpayers about how their information is being used and who's getting it. And that will erode trust in the tax system.
And in the absence of an inspector general to provide accountability, who's going to provide that?
I don't know. If you find out that your information has been improperly accessed, you have access to the courts to be able to sue, and if it's by a third party, it's subject to punitive damages.
And that's after the effect?
That's after the effect. And for the taxpayers who Craig Littlejohn unconscionably exposed their information, that is small comfort.
So if we want transparency, one, we should have Congress needs to have a knowledge of what's going on, and any action needs to be approved by Congress.
That is the Inspector General's task, to detect fraud, waste, and abuse. And in the tax agency, they particularly look at violations of 6103. It is their job to investigate that.
It's unfortunate that there's not bipartisan consensus on that. Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And the chair recognizes Mr. Yacom from Indiana.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Olson, Mr. Littlejohn was an IRS contractor that stole the tax returns for thousands of Americans, including President Trump. He pled guilty to, do you know how many counts of unauthorized disclosure of tax return?
I don't know that I understand, maybe 70 some odd?
One count. One count he pled guilty on. There are, and we prosecute, by the way, for serial killers. We don't prosecute them just on one count. We go after everything. But on this one, we went after truly, ultimately, one count. There are 5,000 IRS contractors today that have access to confidential taxpayer data. Ms. Olson, do you know if the IRS has closed all of the vulnerabilities that allowed Mr. Littlejohn to steal this information?
I don't know that. I do know, in preparing for this hearing, that I found an Inspector General report that reported this summer that the IRS had not retrieved laptops, et cetera, from contractors or limited their access.
In short, the answer
and
is
I am
no.
very concerned about that.
In short, the answer is no. The IRS has not closed the vulnerabilities that allowed
Well,
Mr.
I can't
Littlejohn
answer that question because I don't
I'm
know
giving
what
you
vulnerabilities there were that Littlejohn accessed.
I'm giving you the answer. The answer is no. So the largest wholesale theft of confidential taxpayer information, we had just one charge. How many years is he doing in prison? Do we know the answer to that?
Under 72, I forget the statute, but under the statute, you can only get up to 5 years in prison, and it doesn't matter how many returns you've accessed. So that's something Congress should look at. That maybe
completely agree.
Make that statute per return or per
something
access.
that we should look at. The Biden administration prosecutors argued that just the one count covered Mr. Littlejohn's multitude of thefts. And he leaked confidential tax returns to 2 news outlets. Do you know, are those news outlets authorized to view confidential tax information on those thousands of Americans?
No, they are not.
So as far as we know, do the outlets still have ongoing access to the thousands of confidential tax returns that were stolen or leaked?
I don't know that.
So my colleagues are talking about the sanctity of tax returns while whistling past the graveyard of the largest theft of tax returns in history by Mr. Littlejohn. He stole thousands of confidential tax returns, including President Trump's tax returns, from our fellow Americans, but he's been labeled as a quote-unquote public hero by left-leaning groups because of whose tax returns he actually stole and leaked. Ms. Olson, in your testimony, you noted that the IRS's progress in improving its level of service since the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. The taxpayer advocate found that during the 2024 filing season, the IRS achieved an 88% level of service with an average answer speed of 3 minutes. Does that mean that 88% of all taxpayer calls to the IRS were answered in 3 minutes?
No, what it means, this is part of the problem with that measure. What that measure does is it measures how many calls that were routed by the phone tree system to a live assister were answered. What it doesn't mean is how many calls overall actually were routed to a live assister out of all the calls, and that's where you get to the 32%. Only 32% of the calls were routed to a live assister.
Indeed, because this level of service only counts for 10 million calls out of the nearly 40 million it received, and it does not include taxpayers calling with other questions like tax law questions, compliance issues, identity theft issues, collection matters, nor does it count the calls routed, as you said, to an automated rather than a live assistant. So when you tally all that up, we're talking about only 32%. So when Janet Yellen, President Biden's Treasury Secretary, promised, quote, the vast majority of callers will be connected to live assisters, that was not true necessarily, was it?
Well, not when you count all the calls, that's correct.
So when you, to sum things up, by quoting the taxpayer advocate one more time, the Biden IRS, quote, allocated resources to hit ambitious but arbitrary goals that mean less than meets the eye, and consequently have required the IRS to neglect calls to other telephone lines and work streams like paper correspondence. You know, the pomp and pageantry surrounding the Inflation Reduction Act's improvements to the IRS customer service is, I think, a bit of a mirage. It's like looking at Sunday's Super Bowl result and saying, well, yeah, but Patrick Mahomes, he threw for 257 yards, but Jalen Hurts only threw for 221. So sometimes the underlying stats don't always tell the real and actual story of the game. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I do yield back.
I was wondering how long it was going to be before someone did a Super Bowl reference. Mr. Miller. Who won that game?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for their time and testimony today. We're here to discuss the importance of ensuring taxpayer dollars yield a real return when invested in IRS modernization efforts. The need for a modernized IRS is clear and urgent, as we have heard today. Taxpayers deserve an agency that keeps up with the times, operates efficiently, and acts responsible fiduciary of the American people's money, which is, I believe, what the IRS was intended to do. Modernization isn't just about convenience, it's about safeguarding taxpayer information and delivering a better customer service experience to the American people. They're entitled to this. We know that deploying new, efficient, and secure digital tools could save the federal government billions of dollars. Unfortunately, the IRS has struggled to deliver these intended outcomes, and rather than investing in new and more secure technologies, which is somewhat puzzling to me, and we'll get into it, the agency continues to utilize decades-old systems, which only make sensitive taxpayer information more vulnerable. Mr. Sepp, by now we are all well aware of the legacy systems at the IRS. Not only does the IRS continue to utilize hundreds of old and obsolete systems, including fax machines to store and analyze and transfer sensitive taxpayer information, but the IRS also fails to attempt to improve these systems. And look, let's be real, it looks like I just graduated from high school 2 days ago. I haven't even seen a fax machine out in the wild. I mean, anyone here that is working in technology or innovation in business and technology, or even for the public, government to operate off for the American people. I don't even know what a fax machine looks like. Excuse me. It is confounding to me, and I understand that to a certain extent you may say it's more secure because of a phone line, but I'm not buying it anymore. It's 1960s technology. I was born in 1988. We need to do better. Going back, Mr. Sepp, can you speak to the risk associated with continuing to use and failing to maintain or update these legacy IT systems, especially considering the sensitive and private taxpayer information that is stored on them?
Yeah, there's a huge risk. It's not only a 6103 risk with disclosure being in play, but accidental data breaches that could be massive. I mean, how many other agencies have 1 billion individuals on their master file? I mean, that would rival Social Security, if not exceed it. And again, GAO has said since 2018 those systems are vulnerable. If we don't devote the resources to that kind of security and we continue to worry about fax machines and keeping them up, we are headed for a major disaster. And I would just point out, we still don't have a clear idea of the milestones that the IRS intends to make with modernization and whether they're keeping them. Paperless processing initiative is one of them. By this year, the service is supposed to have all paper tax forms digitized. I don't know, maybe someone on the panel knows, have they met the 100% goal yet?
We know the answer to that.
You do?
Oh, well, I'd speculate. So I shouldn't say I know the answer, but I would speculate that we know the answer to that. And throughout all these conversations, I would think to truly believe that the IRS would do something to meet somewhere in the middle amicably between a fax machine and where we are today in 2025, which I think is pretty reasonable, that there's some other system that could be put in place that would be a lot more safe, secure, and protective of the American people's sensitive information as we are talking about here today. And you know what? This is where I see maybe a need for an outside individual to look at something like the IRS to make sure it is running more efficient and responsible for the American people, as we still have fax machines that are still in an agency which is 1960s technology, which confounds me up and down. So, you know what? I'm glad for Mr. Musk, and I'm glad that he is doing what he is doing with the federal government to clean this nonsense up and to make it more secure and more safe for the American people. Mr. Ladwa, I'm going to do my best to squeeze this one in. If not, we'll try. I'll just go right to the question. Can you provide us a real-world example of tax agency utilizing AI and how this technology can help improve operations and efficiency?
Sure, Congressman. So I'm bound by some privacy agreements from our customers, but I can certainly get back to you and your staff in terms of references and maybe even contacts to said tax agency. But let me answer your question on how they're doing it. So we talked a lot about AI. AI is lots of different things, not just chatbots. So one of the use cases we have is embedded machine learning, so embedded AI, which doesn't essentially leave to go outside of a sort of consolidated system, which is owned by the government, for example. And we're using things like predictions of taxpayer behavior, so we can be more empathetic to the taxpayers who can't pay, and a lot stricter and with higher enforcement for the taxpayers who basically are not willing to pay or are trying to do some fraudulent activity. And we've got examples of that. And I said in my statement, 5% return on investment.
Thank you, Mr. Loudon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Someone from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I first want to register my objection to the idea of 2 Republicans to every 1 Democrat, considering we had the same number of people when we started this hearing. I know it's in your power and purview to do that, but I find it offensive. Let me just first start by saying, we really got to work together to try and solve the problems that we have here, instead of fighting with each other. So I want to just try and get some basic questions answered. There's a thing called the tax gap. How much money is owed to the IRS and how much is collected by the IRS. And the IRS in 2022 projected that there's $696 billion that was owed that was not paid. I wanted to ask each of the witnesses, do you agree that there's a tax gap, and do you agree it's as big as $696 billion? Mr. DeBlas?
I think there's a tax gap. I'm not sure it is that large, and I don't think that the methods employed during the Inflation Reduction Act were the appropriate measures.
Okay, but I'm just asking, do you think there's a tax gap of Do you have any idea of the magnitude of it?
I don't have an idea.
Is it hundreds of billions of dollars?
I don't have an idea of the magnitude.
Okay, Mr. Sepp?
Yes and no.
Yes, you think there's a tax gap. You don't think it's $696 billion.
Correct.
How much do you think it is? Do you have any sense of that?
Less than half that.
So-
When you account for currently non-collectible tax debts and estimates that cannot possibly account for things like when the IRS...
$350 billion. Is
Or
half
less.
that. Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Ladwa, do you have any sense of this?
I would say yes, there's a tax gap. It's probably inappropriate of me from being from the United Kingdom to comment on the US tax gap.
Okay, Ms. Kochlicek?
Yes, GAO, I think, has reported on the tax gap, and we can get back to you with the details on the specifics.
Ms. Olson?
Yes, there's a tax gap. I think there are whole portions of it that can be accurately estimated. I think the hardest part is the unreported income. You don't know what you don't know.
You
but
think
the
it's as
IRS
high as
price-
$696 billion?
It could be 400 billion.
Okay, so hundreds of billions of dollars. Okay, so what's the best way for us to get that money? And I need quick answers from people. What's the best way for us to collect that money?
So it's a combination of doing audits and collection, but also taxpayer service. And if I may just talk about return on investment for a minute. No one's
I don't want to.
calculating.
Ms. Kochlicek, what's the best way for us to collect that money?
I can get back to you on that. I think we do have some.
Mr. Ladwa, what's the best way for us to collect that money?
Understand who's filing late, who's paying late, and why they're paying late.
Mr. Sepp?
Taxpayer service and modernization comes first.
And that includes the technology that Mr. Miller was referring to. We got this crazy outdated system.
Yes.
Mr. Dubois?
I would wholeheartedly agree with Mr. Sepp's answer on that, modernization and taxpayer services.
Okay, people who come to work for the federal government, if you're a cabinet official, you have to go through these big hearings. A lot of people have to go through background checks. A lot of people have to go through security checks. They get security clearance. What kind of background checks or transparency into the background of Mr. Musk or the people that are working for him has been done? Do you know, Mr. Dubois?
I don't know the background checks. I know President Trump had an electoral mandate to create those.
No, I understand
I
that.
think,
But yeah, he has his electoral mandate to hire cabinet officials, but they have to go through hearings and things like that. Mr. Sepp, do you know how these people were vetted?
No.
Mr. Ladwa, do you know how they were vetted?
No.
Ms. Kochlicek, do you know how they were vetted?
We have not looked at these specific individuals.
Ms. Olson, do you know how they were vetted?
No.
What kind of access does Mr. Musk and his team have? What kind of changes have they been making to the computer programs? How many of those changes to computer programs are permanent? And how will that affect people going forward? Mr. Dubois, what's he doing?
I don't know what he's doing.
You don't know.
I
Okay,
think he's
Mr.
looking
Sepp, do you
at.
know what he's doing?
No.
Mr. Ladwa, do you know what he's doing?
It would be inappropriate of me for comment on
Ms.
that.
Kochlicek, do you know what he's doing?
We have not looked at that.
Ms. Olson?
No.
Does anybody here know what they're doing? Does anybody know what kind of keystrokes changes they're making and they're permanent? Does anybody know what their backgrounds are? Does anybody know what they're doing with the information that they have and how they're using it? I agree with my colleagues who noted before that Mr. Littlejohn, who disclosed this information, is a criminal and deserves to be in jail, and I'm happy that he's been prosecuted. And anybody who has violated 6103, that takes private data and shares it with other people should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. We in Congress have an obligation as an equal branch of government to monitor what's going on right now. We're all for finding cost efficiencies. I know Mr. Bean, for example, has the DOGE committee. That's a great thing for us to look for efficiencies, to root out waste, fraud, and abuse. But there's a pesky thing, called the United States Constitution, and it has the responsibilities of the United States Congress in the oversight and power of the purse. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. B.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you, and good morning, Ways and Means Committee. I know there's many members of the minority party that want to create a scandal out of President Trump's desire to know how many improper payments our government sends out each year. And as the co-chair of the House Doge Caucus, just want to take just one little tiny moment and set the record straight. Business as usual is no longer acceptable. President Trump campaigned on changing Washington, and that's exactly what he's doing. President Trump is head of the federal government, and Secretary Bissett is in charge of the Treasury Department. If President Trump and the Secretary Bissett want to open the books on Treasury payment systems, That's their prerogative, and we would encourage them to do so, subject to applicable legal rules. After review and sign-off by career Treasury Department attorneys, Secretary Bissett gave read-only access to 2 Treasury Department officials subject to safeguards that will prevent them from making changes to the payment system. Elon Musk himself does not have access to the system. Neither he nor DOJ have the power to cut off Social Security checks, Medicare benefits, or tax refunds. To clear up other issues, Elon Musk is a federal employee, special government employee, and he currently holds a top secret security clearance that was granted by President Biden in 2022. The U.S. DOJ Service is a duly created organization within the Executive Office of the President, and there is simply no evidence to suggest that Secretary Bissett or DOJ has compromised taxpayer privacy or broken any law. If you're doing what's right, you welcome audits. You welcome the sunshine. You welcome to open the books, and you want the world to see what you're doing. But if not, what do? You criticize the messenger. You criticize the auditor. So it doesn't make any sense to me why this is such an issue. The American taxpayer is dancing in the street and saying, finally somebody is auditing the books that have been hidden in the shadows far too long. Miss Kocholek, is there any evidence at all that confidential taxpayer data has been illegally accessed or illegally disclosed?
We have not done any work to identify if that has occurred.
In short, a no. There's no evidence. There's no evidence. So there's smoke, there's accusations, but no evidence. So let's talk modernization. Mr. DeBlois, Mr. Sepp, Mr. Ladwa, we've been given a D. The IRS has been given a D on the grade of modernization. Is the D the correct grade? Is that fair that they've been given a D?
In our report card, which Debbie Jennings and my colleague Damian Brady contributed to, we think it's a fair grade.
It's a fair grade, but wait a minute. We're using technology in your testimony, Mr. Sepp. You say we're using technology from the 60s. From the 60s. Wouldn't a grade of F be more appropriate?
That was the overall grade based on a B in form design, a C in other
Gotcha.
things.
So it is still a low grade, we agree. Mr. Ladwa, you see world over. You see foreign nations' IRSs. Is it just us, or is everybody stuck in the 60s? Or is it just the United States IRS tax collection?
There are other countries, but a lot of them have already started their modernization some time ago.
Okay, very good. Mr. Du Bois, why? Why is the IRS stuck in the decade of rotary phones and black and white televisions that were 3 feet wide?
Well, I think it's a great question, Congressman, and I think that's the question that the folks over at DOJ and Mr. Musk want to answer, which is why they're rightly turning a microscope under this agency that comes with an electoral mandate from President Trump. There was a poll out this morning I saw coming in that DOJ has a net approval rating well outside the margin of error. As a taxpayer, I'm glad we're getting scrutiny on that, and I would add, There's been a lot of comments about unelected bureaucrats having access, or unelected individuals having access to information. The entirety of the Internal Revenue Service is unelected. I welcome a microscope on that type of expenditure.
And you, like me, like any taxpayer, is ready to do a dance in the street. Finally, they're getting some accountability. But I just can't understand why the IRS is not going forward. It can't be money. We gave them $80 billion, and they doubled down on more fax machines and the same technology that's got us here. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the hearing on modernization. Let's get to it. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for taking the time today to be here and testify about the importance of making sure that the U.S. government is working for her citizens and putting them first. We have all heard about the negative effects of the $80 billion that was given to the IRS through the Inflation Reduction Act and what that negativity has done on Americans. But I want to focus on how this increased funding to the IRS exacerbated external as well as internal threats. If you go back last year, at the end of last year, the U.S. Treasury Department experienced more than one cybersecurity breach by the Chinese government into sensitive U.S. financial information. In these breaches, Chinese hackers stole thousands of documents. We still don't know exactly the impact these breaches have had on our national security, but if it involves China, I think everybody in this panel would agree it's not good. Not good at all. The breach comes amid a number of cybersecurity breaches all over the country due to outdated cybersecurity infrastructure that has proven to be vulnerable to foreign operatives on a number of occasions. While these threats are growing, the IRS is spending more federal funding on targeting American taxpayers through enforcement than it is on improving cybersecurity and modernization to protect the American taxpayer. It's amazing to me. The IRS directed $4.75 billion of the $80 billion it received from the IRA towards system modernization. That is puny. To put that in comparison, the agency spent $45.64 billion on increasing enforcement efforts against American taxpayers, mainly the middle class. In August 2024, the U.S. Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration released a report stating that the IRS had made little to no progress on implementing safeguards for Americans making less than $400,000 a year, even though they continue to jack up their enforcement efforts against those very individuals. That puts Americans in the crosshair and leaves China out of the crosshair, where they need to be in the crosshair. I find this unfortunate and very ironic, given the inability of the IRS simply to answer questions, respond to my constituents. I hear from them every day that they send an inquiry, my taxpayers send back information, and the IRS will not respond timely and will not provide information. Mr. Ladwa, could you explain the ways you've seen other modernized countries throughout the world ramp up cybersecurity efforts within their tax and revenue systems to thwart potential threats, particularly from adversarial nations like China and Russia?
Thank you, Congressman. So what I will say, without going into the details of cybersecurity, is that these commercially available solutions in terms of infrastructure, in terms of application access and stuff, which essentially has taxpayer records and taxpayer information, are battle tested and are created specifically for cybersecurity attacks by spending, us as private sector companies spend like millions, hundreds of millions of pounds ensuring that we're preventative against these types of measures.
Yeah, does anybody on the panel, if you do, raise your hand, does anybody think we need to be spending more money of the money allocated to the IRS towards enforcement against American taxpayers, or should we be doing it more towards enforcement and protection against cybersecurity threats of China? I think everybody in the panel would say we need to protect the American taxpayer. We need to put more into cybersecurity threats and protecting our American taxpayer data than we should about enforcing these mechanisms against the American taxpayers. Do you guys agree with that? Does anybody disagree with that? Ms. Olson, do you disagree that we need to be doing more cybersecurity efforts?
I absolutely agree, and I wanted to make a point about the IRA funding that right now it's limited, it's in different budget categories, and so the IRS is limited with how much it can move from the enforcement category to modernization.
So
that
means we should probably go back and prioritize where that money goes. Would you agree with that? And the priority should be first to protect the American taxpayer and their data from cybersecurity threats by Russia and China instead of going after them on these bogus enforcement actions. Would you agree with that?
Well, I don't think they're bogus enforcement actions, but I think you need to protect them from cybersecurity check.
And that should be our number one priority on the use of the money and reallocate it towards that. Would the rest of the panel agree on that? Yeah, I see the heads bobbing up and down. Mr. Sepp, considering our focus on modernization and innovation, what are some of the ways we may not have touched on yet to think that the IRS, that you think the IRS could do to make it more efficiently work for the American taxpayer?
Certainly improving customer service measurements is important, as my colleague Damian Brady has pointed out. Also, the quality of the advice. If you manage to get through to a live assister, there are 130 topics that are considered out of scope if you ask a question. That's a problem. We also need to be looking at other states, not just other countries, when it comes to improving and modernizing tax systems. A member of the Electronic Tax Administration Advisory Committee was from Missouri. He was at one of our panel presentations describing how Missouri strove for and largely attained a 100% phone service level, and they were very good at it.
Thank you for that. My time is up. I will end by saying this. Taxpayers, in my opinion, are the client, not the target. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Doggett.
Mr. Chairman, you know my respect for you and understanding of your interest in the topics that are here today. But I don't see how we can explore some of these topics and ignore what is going on with the rampage through our government that Mr. Musk and Mr. Trump are engaged in at present. These are not normal times. My understanding was that Speaker Johnson committed to holding a hearing today before our committee on Dodge's, as I call it, or DOGE, unprecedented access to sensitive information. Where is the DOGE representative here today? I agree fully with the comments that our colleague just made from the, as head of the DOGE caucus, he tells us, about if you don't have anything to hide, let the sun shine in. Well, where's the sun shining in on DOGE today? We have had our witnesses questioned by Republican members as to whether they know anything about whether sensitive information has been out there or whether any improper use has been made of this data. Of course they don't know, because it has all been hidden from them and from the world. What we do know is that DOGE really deserves the name Dodge because it is dodging the law, dodging accountability, dodging this Congress, and a federal judge has determined that there is irreparable harm from what they've been doing and has enjoined them from doing what they've been doing and has asked that they return the documents that they took. But there is no one here today to explain there has been no accountability. We don't know how many people. We don't know whether they had any background clearance. We don't know what use they have made, though there have been claims made today and prior to today that they were read-only. There is plenty of evidence that it went far beyond reading and has been used to cut off funds. Mr. Musk has never been elected to anything, and yet through his minions, his musketeers, he's been accorded access to the most confidential information on every American citizen, information about Social Security, about health care, about bank accounts, about tax return information that is so sensitive that if you expose it improperly, you can go to prison for 5 years. The safeguards on this abusive use of this information are lacking. Now, there was reference to the Inspector General. Would that we had an Inspector General, but remember that as a part of insulating himself from any independent accountability, the watchdog over at the Treasury Department was fired by President Trump, along with 17 other inspectors who had the responsibility of safeguarding the public interest and looking for waste, fraud, and abuse. The former career official, 35 years at the Treasury Department, a nonpartisan guardian of our privacy, he was pushed aside because he had the audacity to question this 25-year-old Musk minion coming in and going through the records of every American. This is highly sensitive and confidential information. What we do know, and we don't know much about this 25-year-old, but we know that he recently boasted that, quote, "For the record, I was racist before it was cool," and urged that we, quote, "normalize Indian hate," as he denigrated Indian Americans. That's the kind of person that's been assigned the ability to look at the record of every single one of us, and it cannot be at all clear as to what misuse and abuse of those records may be made. At the same time, within the last 48 hours, the Vice President sent up a trial balloon, and Mr. Musk joined in. Perhaps they don't even need to follow the judge who said that there had been such harm caused by what they've already done. Mr. Musk contends that anyone that disagrees with him is a, quote, corrupt judge. And so he put that brand on the judge who found irreparable harm. And Mr. Vance has suggested that maybe they don't need to follow court orders. Well, they do. There was a vote in the last election for a change, and we should honor that as we did. We were never the election deniers. But defending the Constitution and the laws of the United States are vital, and respecting the independence of this body and of the courts is vital. And that's what is in question today and what is not being addressed adequately in this hearing as the big dodge has taken place on Doge. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from the great state of California, Representative Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank everyone on the panel today. I waived on today's subcommittee. I'm not on this subcommittee. But when I heard the topic, I was sure to wave on, because at home, my phone is ringing off the hook. In all my district offices, in my capital office, when I go home on the weekend, people stop me on the street, in the supermarket, and talk to me at events, because they're very concerned about this chaos that we're seeing in Washington, D.C., especially as it pertains to this unprecedented access to our nation's taxpayers' data. They are concerned. So I assume that's what we're going to be talking about today, and we have. Thank you to my Democratic colleagues for bringing this up. But this is something that deserves the oversight of this committee. And I know that Ways and Means Republicans care deeply about taxpayer privacy, given that every one of them who were on the committee last year co-sponsored and voted for our chairman's bill to increase the criminal penalties for unauthorized disclosure of data when our committee marked it up last May. And let me be clear, I don't know how anybody could think that anyone on this side of the aisle is cheering the illegal activities of Mr. Littlejohn. I think he's a criminal. He's where he belongs. He's in jail, and that's where he should stay. But when we took that bill up, we had near unanimous support for the bill. And the fact that this committee recognized that this crime is serious is evident by the fact that in that bill, we increased the fine from $5,000 to $250,000. And we increased the prison sentence to 10 years rather than 5. So given how important this issue is to all the members of this committee and to our constituents, it only makes sense that we carefully investigate the credible allegations that Mr. Musk and his Doge folks violated federal law by gaining access to taxpayer data. This unlawful disclosure of millions of Americans' most sensitive data is just flat wrong. It's so wrong, in fact, that a federal judge has ordered those who are prohibited from accessing this data to immediately destroy all copies. I'd like to enter for the record a copy of that judge's opinion.
Without objection.
So it's troubling today to hear my Republican colleagues being so silent on this obviously serious issue that is before us and is troubling our constituents. So, Ms. Olson, as a former United States taxpayer advocate, you were responsible for assisting millions of taxpayers. In your time at the IRS, was it ever imaginable that an outside billionaire would be given access to the sensitive information of millions of American taxpayers that you advocated on behalf of?
I will have to say that Commissioner Rosati was a billionaire, but he divested himself of his holdings that would create any conflict of interest.
And he was a commissioner. He
And he
wasn't
was the
just somebody
commissioner,
brought in
and so
from
part
the
of his-
outside because they were a big campaign
And
donor.
under his statutory duties, it's his duty to administer the internal revenue laws of this country.
And if you were the current taxpayer advocate, what message would you send to the IRS commissioner?
Oh, I'd be saying that he needs to be very careful about who is getting in and looking at this, and that everything needs to be cleared through the statutes, that their access is under a congressionally mandated or required, access, grant of access to the return information.
Thank you. I agree with my Republican colleagues that we need to be working with the IRS to bring them up to speed and bring them up into the time and make sure that they are working effectively and efficiently for our constituents. But isn't it true, Ms. Olson, that the IRS has been woefully underfunded for years in being able to address these needed upgrades?
Yes. Be quick, Ms. Olson, be quick and
Yes.
answering. Quick.
Yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Very good. Thank you very much. Let's go to the great state of Illinois. Representative Davis, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to thank all of the witnesses. You know, I was surprised that this hearing was framed as highlighting the lack of return on investment on the critical funding given to the Internal Revenue Service. Frankly, the only way that statement is true is if acting President Musk gives his millionaire buddies who cheated on their taxes back the $1 billion in revenue that the Biden IRS collected. And sadly, I have a concern that he may do just that. President Trump allowed the biggest federal data breach in history when he allowed Elon Musk and his hackers to steal Americans' extremely private financial and health information from the Treasury Department. We don't know if Mr. Musk will illegally stop one's Social Security, tax, or Medicare payments. We don't know if he'll sell our Social Security numbers or bank account information to the highest bidder, or delay government contract payments or grants to his competitors or people he dislikes. Ms. Olson given statements made by this administration that it can decide unilaterally to stop funds to people or organizations that it does not think deserve certain funds. Can you please talk about the power of the Internal Revenue Service to levy taxpayer accounts and to use the Treasury offset program? If this administration decided it didn't think certain Americans or entities deserved certain funds, could the IRS freeze funds from Americans' bank accounts? I'm asking whether it is legal or ethical to take Americans' money like this, but could the IRS or Treasury freeze funds from someone's bank account or subject them to Treasury offset if it wanted to? Typically, we learn about improper access of taxpayer data from the IRS policing itself. If the IRS ignores its responsibility to oversee fair tax policy administration, I believe the only way we'll know that the Trump historic data breach of people's private financial or health information is when those individually affected people notice the harm. So, Ms. Olson, could you speak about the importance of confidentiality at the IRS and Treasury, and why these orders and memos undermining that confidentiality are so dangerous to the American public?
So in response to your question about could the IRS or Bureau of Fiscal Service retrieve funds from people's bank accounts, I would think that mechanically they would be able to. Is it legal? They would need to have a basis in law. They would need to do an assessment. They would need to identify an improper payment, and if the law allowed them to do it, then they could do that. And I think those legal authorities are limited and have due process protections. I would also say that, as our colleague from GAO has said, that internally it's the agencies that decide what's a fraudulent payment or a legitimate payment, and they send that over to BFS, and BFS then issues that payment. It has its own fraud detection by looking at the death master file, or if someone's incarcerated or something like that, and whether that's an improper payment. But the agencies themselves are the ones that execute the improper payments. The problem is if someone has access to all that information and overrides all those checks and balances that are built into the system, and that's what we don't know, is are those checks and balances being overridden or are they not? And that creates great uncertainty in the American populace.
Thank you very much. Can I yield back, Mr. Chairman?
Thank you very much. Let's go to the great Commonwealth of Virginia, where Representative Byer is standing by. Representative Byer, you are recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your enthusiasm. Thank all of you very much for sitting in with us. And I want to make the point that I think everyone on the Ways and Means Committee strongly agrees with the need to modernize. I would like to point out that in the 24 years of this millennia, 12 years led by Republican presidents, 12 years by Democratic presidents, it's not a good idea for us to blame this on one party or the other. In fact, I think our primary argument about putting the $80 billion in for IRS was to modernize, was to bring us into the 21st century. I know SAP, you have some wonderful ideas about what to do. I don't think you're going to do that for free. I've been around politics for a long time and seen technology companies try to modernize things, sometimes successfully. Sometimes they get halfway through and walk away, leaving the government with the tab. So I know you would never do that. But we're going to have to spend money to make this modernization happen. Ms. Olson, you noted in your testimony that Section 6103 of the Internal Revenue Code provides taxpayers with the right to confidentiality once they file their returns with the IRS. And there are only a handful of circumstances in which it's lawful for government officials to disclose or even view a taxpayer's return or information found on a return. With that in mind, I'd like to ask you a hypothetical question. If an unqualified, non-IRS political appointee were granted access to the Bureau of Fiscal Services payment system, and they inspect confidential taxpayer information for political purposes not authorized by law, could that be a crime?
If it's not authorized by law, it would be a crime, in my opinion.
Could it also be a crime for this individual to share private taxpayer information gleaned from rummaging around the Fiscal Services payment system with his boss, an unelected, unconfirmed billionaire?
It would be a crime to share it, to disclose it, yes, to people who do not have authorization to receive it.
And finally, what are the penalties for violating Section 6103, and is there a statute of limitations?
So under 7214, the penalties, as we've discussed earlier, it can be a fine up to $10,000 and then also up to 5 years imprisonment or both. And it is the normal statute of limitation for criminal offenses, 6 years. 3 years from the occurrence, and then in certain aggravated instances, 6 years.
Okay, thank you very much. So if I'm understanding that correctly, this individual would be subject to criminal prosecution 6 years after the end of this current administration, or 6 years after the offense?
It could be if it involved fraud of some sort.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm almost done, but Mr. Dubois, I was fascinated by your testimony, and I intend to send it to the Congressional Budget Office because I'd love to hear the other side of the equation. I'm not accusing you of cherry-picking data, but just based, if that's the only thing I'd heard, I would be horrified. I'd love to hear what the other side is and the defense. Because once again, this is a non-political organization. You may believe that they have a leftist bias, but I think I've been here 10 years, and mostly my Republican friends use their data as often as we do to justify the things that they do.
If I could respond to that, Congressman,
Sure.
and I appreciate that, and I would welcome to hear CBO's response to that. I think looking at the evidence over the last 15 years, it's concerning, and I can shine a little bit of light on something that we're going to be releasing in the next week regarding a research paper matching OPM data through a wide number of government agencies, including CBO, with voter files that demonstrates throughout the bureaucracy an imbalanced federal bureaucracy. It demonstrates that the civil servants, especially in higher-ranking positions, aren't nonpartisan, as is often thrown around. They do have a partisan affiliation that leans to the left side of the political spectrum. Yeah. And I think when you see that reflected in scores that dramatically wind up being substantially wrong years afterwards, and it tends to lean again and again on one side, favoring one side, the side of growing government being underestimated, the size of providing tax relief being overestimated in terms of costs, that's a cause for concern. And I would hope the CBO would have some good answers as to why that might be the case. And
I think it would be, let me interrupt you, if I may, just because we're running out of time, that would be fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading that. My very first response is, what a huge difference in commitment to public service based on the party that you align with. Your willingness to take a smaller salary in order to serve the public, and that may well be true. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the Silver State, better known as the great state of Nevada. Representative Horsford, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member, Ms. Sewell, for holding this hearing. I really have to follow up on the last statements and the question from my colleague to the witness, because it actually goes to my biggest concern that we're not addressing today, which is a data breach, the largest data breach in U.S. history that is happening right now under this administration's watch. And there's absolutely nothing that the Republicans in the House are doing to protect the American people from a data breach. And if the witness is saying that you have matched employees' information from OPM, Office of Personnel Management, with data files, voting files, in order to determine their political affiliation, in order to reach certain conclusions about what? Their civil service? No, I'm not asking you a question. You already explained your position, and I'll look forward to the report. But this is the concern, Mr. Chairman. Why are we not addressing the major issue, which is the largest data breach in U.S. history that's impacting all of our constituents? Not Democrats, not Republicans, not independents, all Americans. Instead of worrying about the harm a data leak on the Internal Revenue Service could mean for the American people and making that the center of this hearing, this administration has instead asked the IRS to deputize their employees to assist other agencies, including ICE, in their enforcement. All the while, my constituents, and yours too, Mr. Chairman, our constituents' taxpayer data is less safe. And we're not addressing that. Yet under Internal Revenue Code 7803, it provides that taxpayers have the right to confidentiality. It was Chairman Smith who rightfully noted that it's this protection that should be afforded every citizen. This fundamental right has been reinforced time and again by several Congresses and administrations, including by the Taxpayer First Act, which I supported in 2019, and tightened protections for Section 6103. The American people trust our civil service to meet their needs, not the billionaire class. And I don't want to know people's political affiliation. When people call my office, I don't ask them what party they belong to. I ask them what they need and how my office can help support them. Ms. Olson, I'd like to focus on your testimony. You note that the IRS holds information spanning from family and business relationships, financial dealings, employment, investments, and medical and educational information. I agree that the effectiveness of our tax system is dependent on taxpayers' trust that the information they voluntarily provide to the IRS will be held confidential. Can you explain what would happen to that system if there was widespread disclosure of this information?
I think that people would stop disclosing information on their returns. They would also be calling you, yelling about this. But I think it would really erode the voluntary compliance system that our tax administration is based on.
And the fact that an unelected billionaire, the richest person in the world, and his hackers have now broken into the agencies and taken this information illegally puts who at risk?
Well, I don't know what they're doing, but if someone is accessing IRS or tax return and return information without authorization under the statute, it is undermining that right to confidentiality, and that will chill taxpayers' willingness to participate in the tax system and voluntarily disclose their information.
And this is the fundamental issue. At a time when we already have tax evasion occurring by the very wealthy, meanwhile, my constituents that try to qualify for the earned income tax credit gets audited at a higher rate that disproportionately affects working people, but yet we're going to not protect their information. It's fundamentally wrong, and this should be the priority of this committee and every other committee until it's resolved. It is not authorized, it's illegal. Elon Musk and his hackers have caused the largest data breach in U.S. history, and they need to be held accountable now. I yield back.
Thank you very much. We're nearing the end of our committee. We've had a great day. It's been brought up 3 times, and that is the overwhelming support this committee is giving the Taxpayer Data Protection Act. It was overwhelmingly supported by this committee. We've talked about it several times. It is stuck in the Senate right now, so members are encouraged to reach out to their senator and say, let's get that Data Protection Act for the taxpayers. Witnesses, you did a great job. Thank you so much. You'll always have this day to say, this was a day I went before Congress and testified. It's your own time. It's your own dime. We appreciate you very much. Members are reminded that they have 2 weeks from today to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Maybe you'll have homework. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Have a great day.